right, good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Or I guess if you're coming from Israel, good evening. I'm Betsy Farmer. I'm the Dean of the School of Social Work at the University of Pittsburgh. And it is my distinct pleasure to welcome you all here this afternoon to hear Dean Mona Khoury-Kassabri tell us about her experiences and her work. So I just want to give you a few logistics. This is obviously a Zoom webinar. We had enough people that we wanted to be careful with how we were allowing people in and also not have a confusing bit of back and forth. So the folks who are joining us in the webinar do not have the ability to speak, but you do have the ability to communicate with us in writing. So at the bottom of your screen, there should be two little bubbles that say Q&A that you can type a question into. And we are going to be monitoring those as we go through. And at the end, we will have a Q&A session where we will convey questions to Mona so that she can convey to, or answer the questions. I also want to let you know that in addition to the Zoom, we also have links on Facebook for anyone who can't get in, so you can get in an alternative way. So other than that, this is a really wonderful opportunity for us because we have had a chance to collaborate with Barbara Burston, who, as many of you know, is a very well-known and wonderful person in the Pittsburgh community. And she was instrumental in actually connecting the school with Mona. And so I wanted to give her a few moments because I know she has invited a group of folks from the community who are particularly interested. And I just wanted to turn it over to her for a moment to say hello and to get us started. So Barbara.
Thanks, Betsy. I too wanted to welcome you all here, the students, the faculty, and others who have signed up for this program today. I'm actually on the history faculty here at Pitt. This is not my office. It's where I do a lot of work at home. But this program that you are part of today to bring Israeli voices to America was started several years ago by my family. We wanted to hear from Israeli civil society activists who are making a difference in Israel outside of the glare of the political headlines. And up until Corona struck, we brought some of these people to Pittsburgh. Mona was supposed to come, but we had to cancel last March. But now we're on Zoom. And we've had some exciting women so far, from a human rights lawyer to a speaking on gender equity, to head of an Ethiopian resettlement agency in Israel, to a ultra-Orthodox feminist, to a woman who runs a battered women's shelter in Jerusalem, and more. And actually, if any of you want to be on my mailing list, let me know. But, and now we have Dr. Khoury-Kassabri, who is yet another unique and important voice in this series. So I'm delighted you're all here to listen and to participate. And so without further ado, I want to turn it back to Betsy Farmer to introduce our very special speaker.
Thanks, Barbara, and welcome everybody again. So we're very fortunate today to have Dean Mona Khoury-Kassabri joining us. And Mona has been Dean of the Paul Baerwald School of Social Work and Social Welfare at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. And she coincidentally became Dean in 2018, as I did. So we are both relatively new deans, although quite seasoned given all that's been happening in recent years. And we had the wonderful opportunity to actually meet in person last year before the world closed down, because she came to DC for the SWIR meeting of social work researchers. And so we had a lovely chance to chat, and we're really looking forward to getting together in the spring when she came back. So this is a poor substitute, but we're glad that we at least get to be together in this format. So Dean Khoury-Kassabri has had a long and illustrious career. She is, among many other things, she is the first female Arab dean in the state of Israel. And she also has spent some time in North America. She did a postdoctoral fellowship at Chapin Hall in Chicago, and she spent some time in Toronto as visiting faculty. Her research is particularly interesting and relevant to a lot of what we are interested in social work and more broadly. She's particularly interested in youth and child welfare with a focus on delinquency and violence. And she has some very interesting grants in her past, but I was particularly struck by the range of her grants that are currently funded, where she has one project that's looking at preschoolers and their aggression and what are the factors that influence and are affected in that. And also a very intriguingly titled grant on policing juveniles in deeply divided cities. And so obviously there are lots of parallels and also lots of differences between the US and Israel. But I think it's going to be very interesting for us to think cross-culturally as she's speaking about the takeaways and the relevance of what she's talking about for us. So without further ado, I could go on for a while, but I know you're all here to hear about Mona's experiences and also her work. And so I would like to take the great pleasure of introducing Dean Mona Khoury-Kassabri.
Thank you, Betsy, and thank you, Barbara, for this opportunity. I'm very happy to be here today. I think I would be much happier if we could meet in person. I think everyone in the world is wishing for that, but unfortunately we are unable, so we should be happy with what we can achieve now. So this is the best that we can do, and I'm happy to be with all of you. So my presentation, I will share with you my presentation. One second. Now, can you see that in full screen? Yeah. So my presentation today will be actually in two parts that are connected in somehow, but I will speak first about my personal experience. As Betsy mentioned, that I was the elected dean in 2018, and I was the first Arab woman to be elected to this position. So I would like to speak a little bit about my way to this position and how I achieved that, and the effects of that on me and on other things in my university. And then I would like to discuss my research, and I will focus on juvenile delinquency in general, but I will be happy also to discuss other issues if people have questions about political violence and other topics that I study in my research. And lately I had this large study on political violence of children in East Jerusalem, which I also can talk about it a little bit if we have enough time. So for those of you who are not familiar with the Israeli society, I will explain shortly about the Israeli context, especially that many of the things that I will say here are also related to my personal story and also to the research that I do. So we are talking about the Israeli society. As we know, maybe we are a very small country. We have 9 million. And the Arab Palestinian minority in Israel comprise 20% of the Israeli population. Compared to the Jewish majority, this community is characterized by higher levels of unemployment and poverty, and also enjoying much lower governmental expenditure of public funds for health and social services and education and many other things. One of the main features of the Arab society in Israel is that it's a young society, so the children comprise 28% of the child population in Israel. It means that in 10 years, the Arab society will become almost 1/3 of the Israeli, or 1/4 of the Israeli society. And also one of the main features of the Arab society in Israel is that it's in general, it's characterized by traditional and authoritarian patriarchal family values, and usually Arab males are expected to be dominant, assertive, and active, whereas women are usually expected to be passive and obedient. But we know that during the last few decades, there has been a lot of change in the Arab society in Israel, and more families contain now both traditional and modern elements. And we can see that the younger generation is much more has Western family values than the others, which is a good thing. On the other hand, it results in a gap of beliefs and values between the children and their parents. And in the case of the work that I do in relation to juvenile delinquency, it might cause also difficulties and problems. So if we go to my personal story and personal journey, as I said, I was elected dean in 2018 for the Baerwald School of Social Work at the Hebrew University. And as you all know, it's one of the best universities in Israel. And for me, in addition to being a personal success, this represented a social achievement. I became the first Arab woman in an Israeli society to be a dean. And I believe, as you can see, I put here some of the interviews that I had in the TV and journals and newspapers about this achievement. As you can see, it catch a lot of attention because it is a historical moment. As you can see in the one that in Israel, in English, it's written here, making history, first Arab woman appointed dean at the university. I was interviewed in the main programs in TV. And the thing is that I was very happy and very lucky to get this position, but the attention can say something about how rare it is. Otherwise, it will not get this attention, because every year someone is elected dean in Israeli university. But because it is very rare, which says something about the situation of the Arab population in Israel, it can give us some information about the expectation of the population and the achievements of the Arab researchers in the Israeli universities. And also one of them, I think one of the main things that I usually say when people ask me, a lot of people, when I was elected, they say, okay, you see, there is no discrimination in Israel. If you are a dean, so it means that everyone can get that, and all the Arabs can be now getting positions in anywhere they want. And one of the quotes that I said that is also in the United States, Obama was elected as a president. And the question, does this mean that now the Black people or African-American don't have any problems anymore because of that? Of course, the question is clear that it's not related, because a person can be elected, it's a irregular achievement. It's not something that we are regular to it. And this is why I think we have achieved all this attention. So a little bit about my childhood and the place I grew up in. I'm not sure how many of you know Israel, but I was born in a city called Haifa in the northern part of Israel, in a disadvantaged neighborhood. And these are two pictures of my neighborhood. My home is here. And this is one of the pictures that give you some idea about how the neighborhood looked like a few years ago. And this was one of the poorest crime drug infested neighborhoods in Haifa. And despite that, I think one of the main things that I believe about this community, that it was the interpersonal relationships between the neighbors were very strong. And if I take it to my research work, I usually say we have to look at the context and at all the factors that might affect the person, and not only the objective factors like the socioeconomic status of the neighborhood. We should also look at the collective efficacy of the neighborhood, which can be a protective factor for protecting children and the youth from getting involved in violence. So, and I think although I grew up in this poor neighborhood, I never felt poor until I moved from my elementary school, which you can see the picture here, to the junior high school. And the differences between the two pictures are a symbol of the many other differences that happened between these two stages in my life. When I learned in the elementary school, I learned actually in a public school with all the kids from my neighborhood. So we all were almost the same thing. We had the same circumstances. We have the same level of socioeconomic status. And actually, as you can expect, I was one of the excellent students in my school. So I didn't feel like something that I'm lower than others. And in my 7th grade, my parents want me to move to high school, which was a private school. And for the first time, I think in my life, I noticed that there are a lot of people that they are rich, which also says something about us and about the place we grew up. And this was one of the changes that I felt that there is something different between us and them. And I think also it was also reflected by the way they studied. Like if I started in my elementary school, we started studying the letters in English in the 4th grade. And my peers in the private school, they started learning English, French, Italian, Hebrew, and Arabic from their 1st or 2nd grade. So when I arrived, they all were also know 5 languages when I was like struggling with Hebrew, Arabic, and English. So this can give you some picture about the differences. And one of the main difficulties that I faced in this change is that the private school, of course, as you all know, we had to pay for that school and we were not able to pay for the tuition of the school. So me and my sister, we had to clean the classes after the day ends in order not to pay the tuition, and we did that for like 3 years because in Israel in 10th grade it becomes public and you don't have to pay. So for 3 years we cleaned the classes in order to be able to study in this private school. So after that, when I completed my 12th grade in this school, I worked for 1 year in order to have money to pay the university tuition. And I started my undergraduate in the School of Social Work and Social Welfare at 93. As you can see, since that time I have been there. And I did my master's and finished all my degrees with honors. And I started my PhD in the direct track in the School of Social Work and Social Welfare. And when I completed that, I started thinking about the postdoc. And I'm saying that it seems like I planned that. But if you ask me if I knew that I want to go for postdoc when I started my undergraduate, I can say honestly that I didn't know what is that postdoc. And I didn't know what are the expectations of someone who wants to work at the university. So when I started my undergraduates, I knew that I will finish my degree and then maybe I will go for master's. But I didn't think that I will go for PhD. And I think a lot of the support that I got from the school, that my professors and the head of the master program asked me, he said, I looked at your grades and they are very good. Do you want to join the direct track? And I was so happy. So I said yes. And then I completed very fast my PhD studies. And at the end of my PhD studies, I was told that if I want to work at the university, I should go for postdoc. And now this is a new thing. And I think the background that I gave you about the Arab society is very relevant. I think it's something that is relevant for all women in Israel, and that many of the researchers struggle with that, but also in traditional societies, it's even more difficult because you have now to go abroad and to take your family. And the question is whether this is okay and how this will be accepted, especially because my husband were not able to come with me for the entire year. So we had to decide, and then we decided together that I would go, at the beginning, we go together, and then he came back to his work, and he was coming to visit us. And one of the difficulties that I had in this year, that I had to go also with 11-month daughter, which is now almost 19 and starting her university soon. So I think this also was, I was able to do that because I believe that in order to succeed, I have to work hard. And this was part of the working hard, because otherwise I will not get a position at the university. And I was able to go for this year because I got also 2 very prestigious scholarships, the Fulbright Postdoctoral Award and also the Chapin Hall Center Postdoctoral Award. So I completed 1 year of postdoc, and then I came back to Israel and I completed another year of postdoc at the Hebrew University at the Criminology and Psychology Department. And if we are talking about education, and from my experience, I think that I try to do a lot in order to be able to help as much as I can other students to get into higher education. And one of the things that I do at the university, in addition to being the Dean of the School of Social Work, I am the advisor for minority affairs to the Hebrew University president. And one of the things that we do is implementing a program that was launched 5 or 6 years ago by the Council of Higher Education, which means the main objectives of this program is to increase the numbers of Arab students in Israeli universities, and also to help them to complete their studies successfully. And as you can see from this slide, the numbers, we were able to increase the numbers dramatically of Arab students at the Hebrew University, especially in the undergraduate, in the BA program. And we still have a lot of work to do with the master's and PhD programs because the numbers are very low. And actually the lowest number that we have are in the staff, academic staff at the university. In Israel, it's around 3%, 2.7%, and at the Hebrew University, it's also around 1.5%. So it's very, very, very low. And I think one of the main things that we should work on during the coming years is supporting students in the undergraduates to help them and encourage them to go for masters and then to go for PhD and postdoc in order to be able to join one of the universities in Israel. So this was very short, my presentation. And Betty, how much I have in order to complete about the research?
Oh, another 15 minutes, say?
Okay. So in 15 minutes, I will tell you a little bit about juvenile delinquency. And my research is actually guided by the socio-ecological contextual model of human behavior. And I will present few of the results that we found. And I mainly want to focus actually in the second goal of my presentation, which focuses on the mediation and moderation effects of individual, family, and community factors on youth behavior. And I will try to discuss some of the gender issues, but I'm not sure how much we will have time. My research is quantitative research. I usually have large samples. One of my PhD was based on 16,000 students, and my other studies now are based on numbers between 3,000 and 5,000 students, and some of them include teachers and others include parents. And mainly, as I said, they are guided by the socio-ecological perspective. And I focus on studies in different levels. At the individual level, I focus on gender, religiosity, age, and impulsivity. And I will talk a little bit about the issue of religiosity, which is a very important factor with respect to the individual ones. At the family, usually I focus on parental control, parental relationship, intimate relationship, and other factors, and family socioeconomic status. Peer group, because I study juvenile delinquency, the peer group is very relevant, and especially the affiliation with delinquent peers. And also I usually discuss the issue and ask about exposure to community violence as also a direct victim or just witnessing violence. And before moving to that, one of the things that actually I found consistently is the effect of parental factor on child behavior. And examining parenting is very important during adolescence, because a lot of people say, and also I say that because the research shows that children spend a lot of time with their peers. And one of the main questions that is raised here, whether parents still have the power or the effect on their children, whether they can influence their behaviors. And consistently in all the studies that I have done, we can see that parents usually still affect their children's behavior. And I will show you after that how also this can moderate the effects of other risk factors. So as I said, another important factor that we have been studying lately is the religiosity. And 5 years ago, I think the research was inconsistent in the finding regarding religiosity. Some shows that it can increase violence, others show that it can relate to lower levels of violence, and others show unrelated factors. But in my research during the last few years, also the study that I have done among Israeli Arab students from Israel, other parts than Jerusalem, and especially in Jerusalem, and among Jewish students, we can see that the stronger the religiosity, the lower the involvement in violence. And in one of the studies, we found that it was related also to lower levels of political violence. In a large study in that respect, actually, when we had a larger study, we found that it's not related, which is also still very much surprising, because a lot of people might expect that the more religious the children, the more they are involved in political violence, which we didn't find that. So I think this is very important, because the Israeli society gives us the opportunity to examine the effect of religiosity among different religions. And we found consistently the same thing among Muslims, Christians, and Jews. So we know that there is something in the religious values or in religiosity that acts as a protective factor against youth involvement in violence. Another thing that you all might expect, that affiliation with delinquent peer, the more you are affiliated, the more your peers are involved in violence, you are also increases the likelihood of being involved in violence. And we know that this is very important for in juvenile delinquency, because research shows that youth usually do a crime together. And when your peers are delinquent, so it increases the probability that you will be involved also in that. Another thing that we show, and I think we all might expect that the higher the direct and indirect exposure to community violence, the higher the adolescent involvement in violent behavior. And one of the questions that I think is more important actually than the direct effects is, because we know that if you are exposed to violence in the community, as a parent, you don't have this much of things to do. You can't lock down your child at home. So the question that I raised in these works is whether there are factors that might moderate the effects of risk factors, such as the peer group and the community. And in one of the works that we have done, we explored whether religiosity and affiliation with delinquent peer, how religiosity moderate the effect of affiliation with delinquent peer in serious violence involvement. As I said, affiliation with delinquent peers affects the involvement in serious violence. The more you are affiliated, the more you are involved in violence. And we wanted to check whether religious kids, among religious kids, this relationship is less stronger and weaker. And as you can see from these results, we can see that there is an interaction effect between that, and the relationship between affiliation with delinquent peers and violence was weaker among religious children than among non-religious children. Another thing that, as I said, is very important, whether we know that exposure to community violence increases the involvement in violence. And the question is whether as a parents, we have something to do in that respect. So I wanted to check whether parent-child support can moderate this relationship. And as you can see here, it was found that parents, supportive parental relationships can moderate the relationship between exposure to community violence and youth involvement in violence as perpetrators. So it means that also for kids who are exposed to community violence, if they have supportive relationships with their parents, they will be less violent than other kids who don't have this kind of relationship with their parents. Another thing that actually we wanted to explore also, again, parental support, whether it can moderate the relationship between affiliation with delinquent peers and alcohol use, in addition to exposure to community violence. And consistently, we found the same thing, that children, parent-adolescent communication moderated the relationship between experience of community violence and alcohol use. So it means this is, I think, the last two findings are very important, because we know as a parents, in a lot of times we don't have this much of things to do. It takes a lot of intervention, and a lot of investments is needed to change the community and the level of violence in the community. And as a social workers and practitioners, the question what we can do, and one of the things is actually helping parents to be very supportive and very important characters in their children's lives. And again, one of the things also that I worked on is cyberbullying. And in addition to this study, I have a longitudinal study on cyberbullying in Canada. And in this work among Israeli students, we wanted again to check whether parenting can moderate not only exposure to community violence, but impulsivity. And this is very important and very unique, because as you all know, impulsivity is perceived as something that you have it even inherited, or it's a character or feature that you have it from your very young age, and it's very difficult to affect that. And the results of this study actually showed that supportive parenting or monitoring parenting was able also to moderate the effects of impulsivity on cyberbullying. So it means that although we believe that impulsivity is something that is very difficult to change, also among teenagers, when parents were involved in their lives and they know, when we ask about monitoring, it wasn't monitoring in regard to the use of the internet. It was a general perspective of monitoring, and we asked them about whether they know with whom their children, all these traditional factors of parental monitoring. And we know, and the results show that the more that parents were monitoring, the relationship between impulsivity and cyberbullying was weaker, while where parents were not monitoring their children's behavior, this relationship was very strong. And the same thing here we have with exposure to community violence. So if I want to sum up all these things, I think if I will take my personal story into what I have said so far, I think and I believe that education is a right for everyone, and we all should work in order to give this opportunity to every child. And from my experience, as I said, a lot of people say, if you could achieve that, so anyone can do it. And I actually don't like this way of saying that, because I did that in a very hard work, and I had to clean classes and I had to clean other places in order to do that. And I ask myself always why a child needs to do that, why should not be the people who are responsible for giving them these opportunities as others, as all other privileged groups in the Israeli society, that they get to the university without struggling. So I believe in hard work, maybe a lot of people can do it, but why it's not an opportunity for everyone. And another thing that I know from education, and I didn't discuss that here, but in all my studies, I found that there is a very significant relationship between commitment to school achievement and lower levels of juvenile delinquency. So education is also giving education and a future and a commitment to to get into high school and into higher education is also something that helps in reducing levels of violence and delinquency in the society. This is why also we should invest in that. And another thing that, as I said, also from my personal history and story, we know that there is no one factor that affects individual behavior. I was born in very disadvantaged, I was exposed to violence in my childhood. And then when we talk about the moderating effects, if I would talk about it and look at that, I believe that my parents were the moderating factor that actually reduced the effects of being exposed to community violence and delinquency, because they were very supportive, very encouraging. And I think this is why me and my sister, we were able, despite the fact that we grew up in a very disadvantaged neighborhood, to go to higher education and to learn. And also we were very much committed to achievement, which is also related to what I said earlier. And also there is something that I would say about religiosity, that actually as a secular person, I can say that there are a lot of factors or a lot of values among religion that maybe we as a secular people, we should look at them and I don't call for being religious. It's something that a decision that a person should do for himself, also for youth. But we should look what are these values and how come that religious children are less violent and less delinquent than secular children. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to answer your questions now. I will stop the share.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was a lot of information in a very compact format. So I'm going to be monitoring both the chat and the Q&A, but if people could put their questions in the Q&A, that will make it easier for us to look in one place and have things. So if you have a question for Mona, please open up the Q&A at the bottom of your computer and type in your question and we will ask her. So we have one question that is sitting here getting us started right now. And it's a question about how you're using the data that you've reported on. And how are you sharing it with and working with civil society organizations to make use of this knowledge that you have acquired?
Yeah, actually, I do a lot of work also, not only with a civil society organization, with a social work organization. I didn't mention that, but like the study that we are doing in East Jerusalem, it's actually a study that we are doing that with a juvenile probation office and with justice office and the police. We all together, we are the researchers, but we all together have like a monthly meeting. We discuss the results because it's also we have intervention there that we are doing the evaluation of that. So we work together, and a lot of my research work is on a collaboration with the juvenile probation office. So we work together in these parts, and I do also evaluation research for these services, which we discussed there.
Great. There are some questions coming in at the moment in both formats here. You talked about political violence at various points during your talk, and there's a question about how you define political violence versus other types of violence as you're looking at you're collecting data or interpreting what you're finding.
So one of the, okay, it's not an easy question. Actually, because we are working with the police, you can imagine how this discussion goes with them. And those of you who are aware of the Israeli society and the society in East Jerusalem, and actually my husband is an officer in the police, so you can imagine this discussion about what we consider as political violence as researchers and what they consider as like not political violence. They wanted to call it differently. But in our research, we differentiate actually for regular violence and juvenile delinquency. We use the traditional questionnaire of Elliot, which is a very famous, much used in a lot of studies. And for our studies, we use a typical kind of violence that people use in Israel in political violence, just such as participating in demonstrations that they are not, they don't have permission, throwing stones on people, or attacking people without any reason only because you think they are Jews. Okay, so we have this kind of political violence issues.
Interesting. Okay, well, the questions are pouring in now, so let me see if I can ask them quickly so that we can get to a lot of different topics that people are interested in. You talked about religiosity, and religiosity, as we all know, has a lot of different dimensions. And so there's a question here about whether there are differences between, not sure exactly the right words, but between kind of mainstream or traditional religions and perhaps more radical or extreme versions of religions, and whether you have any information on that.
So one of the things actually, I believe, I can't see the people here, but usually when I talk about religion, it's the same as political violence, discussing that with the police. Religiosity, discussing that with secular people, it always has something that people don't want to believe in these results. And I usually focus on that, and I usually mention that I'm a very secular person. And this is what I found. And I say to secular people, let's think what religiosity has that these kids learn. So if we want to talk about the extreme part of religiosity, we didn't have these kind of things because we asked youth, normal youth in Israel, in the Israeli society, and we asked them about the religiosity. The main thing, and I think the main, like the thing that we added to the literature in that thing that usually people ask, and this was the main limitation of previous studies, they focus on one kind of religiosity. They ask people whether they go to church, to mosque, and they ask them how religious you are. And this was one of the main problems in exploring religiosity, because they are different dimensions, and we use multi-factor dimension, a multidimensional definition of religiosity, which includes also behavior and also things that you do, even that you are alone, like reading in religious books or doing things that you believe that they are good to do them, even if no one knows about them. So this is the main things that we added, that we are not focusing only on behavior that people see that you are doing that. And it's sometimes, a lot of times, you do it because of social pressure, not because you are religious.
So talking a little bit more about your studies and who your studies have included in their samples. There's a question here about whether your studies are strictly on Israeli Arab children, or if it's more broadly Israeli children in general, or if it's even broader than that. So let me leave it at that for this question.
Yeah, so actually my work is on all the Israeli society. My PhD was about school children. I said 16,000 students, but it was part of a larger study that included also 25,000 students, Jewish and Arab students from all Israel. The study that you mentioned about violence in early childhood, it's about Jewish and Arab mothers. So a lot of my research is including Jewish and Arabs, and I compare between them. But some of my studies are focusing on Arab children, such as the study on political violence in East Jerusalem, which is a very specific phenomenon that we had to check it deeply on this society.
Wonderful. Let me turn it over to Barbara. I've been asking a lot of questions about the research side. Is there anything that strikes you in the chat or the Q&A that you would like to bring to Mona's attention for an answer?
I'm looking at one question here. What approach can you take with children living in or experiencing violent circumstances whose parents had the same childhood experience? Where do you begin?
I can talk like about 3 hours about that. You know, as a social worker, we should begin somewhere. We can't give up. We should begin, and I think we should begin with family therapy, because if we don't help the parents, many times, actually, one of the things, if I talk about juvenile delinquency, one of the laws or in one of the states in the United States, that it says we should punish the parents. But we know the situation, as this question was asked. The parents, in many cases, they are also victims of a lot of violence, and in their history, we can't punish them. We should help the parents in order to be able to help their children. And the earlier we do it, the better. So if you ask me, I worked when I was in Chicago in a project that the intervention was given for women at risk when they were pregnant. I think this is the best stage to start, if we can.
Mona, let me just ask you, are you optimistic about the integration of Arabs into Israeli society? Do you think things are, getting better, or are you, what is your personal perspective on that whole issue?
So Barbara, I think we know each other from emails. At least you know how optimistic I am. And if I wasn't optimistic, I wouldn't do 2 positions at the university when I'm like very much like very, very, very busy. And I'm very optimistic. I think through education, we can change the Israeli society. And I really believe in that. I think that the more we bring students to the university and the more we give them the opportunity to succeed and then to have work and then to go to the job market and have the opportunities, we can change this society. Otherwise, if the Arab society will still the society that is uneducated, with a lot of employment, with a lot of poverty, we will not change this society. We should invest in education, and I believe this can change the Israeli society. And I see that actually one of the things that we are doing at the university with students from East Jerusalem. During the last 5 years, there has a tremendous change on the amount of students from East Jerusalem who study at the Hebrew University. If you would ask me 5 years ago if I believe that now we have 560 students studying in pre-academic year, preparatory year at the university, I would say, no way. You are too optimistic. And this is the situation now. And I think this is the way we can change, because these students, then when they complete this year, will come and study, at least 50% of them study at the Hebrew University. I think this is one of the main achievements that we had during the last few years.
And I just think it's interesting because in a sense you can model what we need to do here in America with our own minorities, especially African Americans.
So I'd like to actually follow up on that, Mona, because as Barbara suggested, there are direct parallels here for what universities in the United States are trying to do. So what was the process or the collective will that made it possible to make those changes as you're looking back at how those came about?
People who believed in that, and funding. Without funding, nothing would happen. Like, we believed in that, and the rector of the university is very much like wants to do that, and he was very active in increasing access for Arab students to the university before being the rector of the university. You called maybe provost, in Israel it's called the rector and the president. But we needed the fund, because if we don't have the funds, we are talking about the society, as I said, also about violence and other things. This is a very poor society. They can't afford paying the tuition of the Hebrew University, especially that they have to pay higher tuition because they have to study in the international school for students. So if we didn't get the funds, and which interestingly, the funds were received by the Council of Higher Education in this situation that we know that the government in Israel is not very much left-wing, but it funded this program, which is something that is like not consistent with the policy, but we have a lot of explanation for that. I don't think it's the time we have the time to discuss it, but without the funds, we were not able to do anything because we wanted to do that. And now when we have the fund, we have the ability also to expand the program. And people are talking about that more. All the faculties, if you talk with the deans, they talk about increasing access, helping Arab students, helping Haredi students. Haredi students is the ultra-Orthodox Jewish students that we want also to increase their access to the education, Ethiopian students. So now we all talk about the underrepresented groups in the Israeli society.
So following up with that, and that's very directly how you're helping the youth as they're developing, but there's a set of questions here about supports for parents in Israeli society, and you talked a little bit earlier about very young children and then about the importance of monitoring and communication and other factors as children develop and get older. What like in Israel, what's in place, and if you have any sense of what might be effective and actually working?
You know, one of the I think the unfortunate things in Israel, I believe it's also in the States, but that the intervention is given when the child is being accused with the crime and he's delinquent and he's going to the probation officer, then everyone remembers that we should help them. And then the intervention starts. And this is the main difficulty. But this is the situation that we have now. So when he is there, we try to work with the parents. But because we know that the funds should start earlier, but as in any other field, it's also the social services that built this way, that when you don't have this much of funds, you focus on the problem and you don't focus on the people who are, you should do prevention programs rather than intervention. But we are not there, unfortunately. So the only way we help families, only if they have like family violence and then they are accused, there is a file for them in the police, and then the social workers are involved. And I believe this is not the correct way, but this is the only way that we have now with the limited funds that social workers have.
Yeah, it's a huge issue in a lot of societies that we use our money reactively rather than proactively to prevent problems. And it makes sense in some ways, and it's not at all a great idea in others. We're getting very close to the 1 o'clock hour, and I want to be respectful of people's time. So I think that the final question might bring us back a little bit to some of what you're doing at the university in terms of students and in terms of increasing diversity at your university. And so there are some questions about, you know, where Arab students are coming from, particularly into social work. And then I'm also curious, as you're talking about increasing master's level and PhD level training, what is the job market like in Israel? Is there a huge demand for social workers that's currently not being met? And how are you approaching that?
So social workers, during the last few years, because of what I said about East Jerusalem, we have a lot of students coming from East Jerusalem, which is very good because we know, and it's connected to your other question, the main problem in East Jerusalem that there are not a lot of Arab social workers. And a lot of the social workers are people like me who came to Jerusalem to live here, but they are from the north. And in some point they move back, and there is a lot of changes in the social workers in Jerusalem. And this is why actually we wanted to increase the numbers of students from East Jerusalem who study social work at the Hebrew University and can serve their society and they can work at the society. But we also have students coming from all over Israel, like mainly from the, what we call the triangle area and the north. From the south, we don't have this much of students. Bedouin students who live in the south usually go to other university, Ben Gurion University and rarely they come to the Hebrew University, but we're also trying to help them. And actually, one of the things that I saw there that people ask about the segregated education system in Israel, I think it's true what was written there, that Arabs and Jews usually, and a lot of other Israeli societies, I think even I said the Triangle area, which is an Arab area in the central parts of Israel, I have never met someone from there before I arrived to the university. So it's not only Jewish and Arabs, it's also Arabs in other groups, and I believe Jewish students from different groups. We don't arrive, like we don't meet in other, because the education system is segregated. You know also that Jewish education system is also different. There is a religious one, a secular one, and the ultra-Orthodox one. So all these people come together to the university, and there is a very important project that we do at the university, which is called the Israeli Hope in the Academia, which is a project that is led by the president of Israel, and it's implemented in all universities in Israel. That the main thing is to not only to increase the numbers, but to let these people also talk together and be, you know, all the issues of cultural competence, and to increase the knowledge about each group and the differences between them. So this is one of the other things that we do at the university.
Well, we're at 1 o'clock, and this is the part where Zoom makes me sadder than anything else, because if we were together, we would now take you out to lunch and continue this conversation in a small group. And I'm assuming Barbara would have a gathering in her house tonight with a lovely discussion. You have thrown out a zillion different things that I think we could pick up on and probably talk for days about. So I so much appreciate you taking the time to do this with us. I think that if people note commonalities or connections that they'd like to reach out to Mona, please let either Barbara or me know. We're more than happy to connect you up. And it's been wonderful to come together. And thank you, Barbara, for connecting us and for making this happen. And thank you, Mona, so much for taking the time. And thanks, everybody, for your great questions and your participation this afternoon. So
thank you. I put my email here, Betsy. So if people want, they can connect me. I just wrote it in the chat. So please feel free to contact me. And
I look forward to seeing you at some point back in Israel, and
me too.
Our friendship.
Yes. Yes. Well, thank you so much.
much.
And I hope everybody has a wonderful day. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.